We have incredibly strong panelists this morning. Karen Aldridge-Eason, who is the gold standard in Michigan, is the liaison for the state on loan from the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation. Karen created that office and works with the governor, the executive office staff, state officials, foundations, and nonprofits to increase strategic partnerships between state government and foundations aimed at improving public policy. So welcome, Karen. Pamela David is such a force in the Bay Area, our friends to the north, and is president and CEO of the Walter and Elise Haas Fund, a family foundation working to build a vibrant society in which people feel connected to their community. Pam is a force, as I said, in the Bay Area and has led efforts to build more effective relationships between philanthropy and government, strengthening communities' capacities for social change. Welcome, Pam. Susan Immerman has spent more than 20 years in the independent and public sector, spanning philanthropy, federal government, and nonprofit program development. She was the senior advisor to former Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan, where she created a new function for private-public partnerships as the DOE's first director of strategic partnerships. Welcome, Suzanne. And finally, Jim. Jim is the Chief Impact Officer currently at 2U, overseeing university partner program implementation, research, and university relations. But more importantly for us today, and in his portfolio, Jim served as Deputy Secretary and COO of the U.S. Department of Education and was the architect of many of this President Obama's innovative programs, including My Brother's Keeper, which continues very strong to this day. So we're going to get right underway this morning. And Jim, I'm going to have you lead off with a perspective that we all, I think, would like to hear and we still continue to wonder about. A lot of past administrations haven't been as aggressive in these public philanthropic partnership efforts. What motivated this administration? What motivated this president to really take action?
First, I should always qualify that whenever I start talking, I'm going to say like we, and then usually when I say we, I mean Suzanne. Because what this administration figured out, both across the administration but with the Department of Education leading, is a pretty fundamental thing, which you know every day, is that foundations are at the front lines of trying to achieve a lot of the same goals as government, do it in ways that are more flexible, more nimble, more have the ability to lean in ways that we can't, and that can inform the work that we do. And so we were looking for every opportunity for leverage and insight that we could get, both from gathering from the work of philanthropists that are insightful in the field and in terms of leveraging your flexibility and capacity to do things we can't. And I'll give a couple of examples of that. We'll talk about it in the context of the Department of Education, but you'll know that many agencies after Suzanne created the Department of Ed actually replicated it across the administration. One of the first things that became apparent is that we had a unique opportunity. Now, this seems like ancient history now, but I just want to remind everybody what happened. It was 2008. Everyone thought the world was coming to an end. There was a financial collapse. Your retirement was underwater. And for those of us that were focused on education, the cuts in public funding made it look like you're going to lose hundreds of thousands of teachers. And what wound up happening in that context was Congress passed the Recovery Act, which the president had the foresight to carve $100 billion out of to stabilize education and put $10 billion towards reform. There were two programs that everyone talks about out of that, Race to the Top and the I-3 program. There was also the School Improvement Grant program. They moved very, very quickly, extraordinarily quickly. Some would say way too quickly, but they were there. So I'll talk first about I-3, which is work most closely with you. Let me talk for a second. And then I'll talk a little bit about the Race to the Top piece as well and let Suzanne say more about it. When I came in, the I-3 program is part of the legislation described it as the What Works and Innovation Fund. And I tell this story, and forgive me if you've heard it before, getting a call literally on my second day on the job from one congressional staffer saying, we're so excited. This is finally our chance to really leverage rigorous evidence. We're going to just fund those things that get just the highest levels of evidence. And literally 2 days later, getting a call from another staffer saying, this is so exciting. We're going to be able to think out of the box. Really innovative practice. And what we were able to do is design a program that reflected the notion that you needed an innovation pipeline, that the people give a lot of credit, but it had one single fundamental insight, and that was a little bit of money for a little bit of evidence, which was not that little, and a lot of money for a lot of evidence. Well, several things happened as we tried to put that together, the design and all that good stuff. But what we decided was, and for me in particular, coming from, those who don't know, I was in philanthropy before I joined the administration, is you have a little bit more control over the decision-making process. Like you actually get to meet the grantees.
What a change, right?
For much smaller checks. And so one of the things that we said was we wanted a matching requirement. Not, as many people thought, because we wanted to amp up the dollars more, but because we wanted someone else to have two roles. One I didn't talk very much about at the time, which is, you're designing this process where you don't make the decision. You hope other people who are peer reviewers, who you also don't really meet, are going to make the right decision. But I said, any of the organizations that get our funding that can't raise a private match with 4-to-1 public leverage, we probably made a mistake on. Like if they literally cannot find any philanthropist out there that wants to fund them, then something's not right. Recognizing all the things we know about how hard it is to make that work. And I'll talk about that in a second. The second thing was our government employees probably have in their budget the ability to do one performance visit a year. And that's for their entire portfolio of grants. So the ability to actually support grantees, the ability to actually lean in and see what's happening on the ground, that ability to support, especially things that are new and emerging in the way they need to be supported, as you all know, is very limited from within government. So we wanted other people in there with us who had skin in the game, who wanted to see them be successful and had a very clear sense of the outcomes that we're shooting for. Several things need to happen there, though, and I'll stop talking after this and turn it over to whoever you want to go to.
Okay.
Suggestions, man, to talk about the reality is the infrastructure is not there to facilitate a lot of the work. Collective investment. So, when I was in philanthropy, I had this dream that we would take a collective theory of action. We would all get around the table and we say, okay, you take this piece and I'll take that piece and we'll all work together. It doesn't always work out that way. And so some of the foundations got together and created a platform that made it easier, called the Foundation Registry I3, for people to pool funding and support those folks that actually got grants. They, when it came to the top, got together and said, we're going to put the money out, but we can't provide the kind of technical assistance that's required because it's not in there. We'll provide a lot of technical assistance in the front, and Suzanne arranged for a lot of that. So I'll stop talking.
I just really, though, want to say something to people that are existing within cultures in government.
Yep.
How high did this come from, that this was, you had the money.
Oh, yeah.
We had a terrible situation in the country, and obviously there were resources available. You had the knowledge. But there's got to be a driver at the top of this that said, this is what I want done. Did it go as high as the White House, where you were getting directions from the President of the United States to go ahead and execute on the level that you were? I mean, is this where the idea that I support public-private partnership, I support this relationship with philanthropy, how do I go there? Share with us.
That basic philosophy of inclusion and partnership is something that I think is signature, people kind of recognize it as a signature of Obama administration. The manifestation of that came through permission to do the things that we decided needed to be done. The reality is that it happened so early on. People didn't even have a construct of how this stuff was supposed to work. So what I'd like to say is, like, the President gave permission. We had an unprecedented opportunity with the funding that came through the Recovery Act, and then you had to give it shape. And the most important thing that happened at that point is Secretary Duncan and the President and everybody in between said, go. And the importance of that cannot be understated. The number of people who have to deal with in government, people who say, I don't know, we might get in trouble, it cannot be underestimated. And so creating the context for people to be able to say yes is not only important for leadership, but also important for philanthropists thinking about how they engage with government. Putting yourself in their shoes and saying what makes it easier for them to say yes, and giving on the things that, frankly, aren't that important but make it easier. It's a big and important lesson learned.
Suzanne, I'm seeing you nodding your head about that. And
Well, and the other, a major signal of that also comes out of the White House, the creation of the White House Office of Social Innovation. You know, that I think from a symbolic standpoint, there was huge excitement within the nonprofit and philanthropic sector at the creation of that office, coming from the highest office. This was an executive office reporting right into the Domestic Policy Council and the president. That really signaled to the field, even though it wasn't entirely clear to all of us even what specifically that office was going to be implementing over time. It was certainly really influential in creating the Social Innovation Fund, which eventually was run out of the Corporation for National and Community Service. But I think everyone knew in the philanthropic and nonprofit sector that this was sort of a new day, that this office was being created that was saying the philanthropic and independent sector, we want them at the table and want to set a table for them right from the get-go, which was also a major signal to all of us that we could kind of move forward, as Jim was saying.
some of your role was to interface with the corporate sector, Suzanne, and I mean, that becomes another element of this partnership model. Can you talk a little bit about that and how you attempted to access this very complicated group of people?
Absolutely. And I can't stress enough that certainly came from the top of this permission to do this, but certainly was also such a huge priority for the secretary and the folks, Jim Shelton, who he brought in early on to help set the table for this. And I think just sort of a lesson learned for us, and I will then go right into the corporate question, but for those thinking about doing this or helping enable this to happen at the state or local level where you're doing your grant making is really placing it in a position of privilege within the administration, whatever that is. There was a really deliberate thinking to put this strategic partnerships function in the office of the secretary as opposed to somewhere sort of maybe perceived as buried within the bureaucracy of the Department of Education. And that stuff is important, even though it didn't cost us any more money to do that, and we didn't take up a lot of the secretary's time or energy, but it was a real signal to the field that this was a priority. That matters to boards of trustees. It matters to CEOs. They want to feel like they're being seen and heard at the highest levels, and so I do think that makes a difference when you're thinking about where to go. We did really, I'd say in the beginning, we were focusing on the philanthropic sector, partially because the foundation community was coming to us in droves in a way that I think was really exciting and made it easier for the department, for all of us to just respond. We had very high-level foundations coming and saying, we want to help, we want to be at the table, we have dollars, we have insights, and we want to be there. We then realized that we wanted to expand that portfolio and bring in corporations. I'd say we probably made a bit of a mistake and kind of mid-course corrected that we were focusing on corporate foundations in the beginning. We sort of were thinking we'll go after private foundations, family foundations, community foundations, and corporate foundations. And that was easy as far as getting folks to come into the room. As someone who had worked in corporate philanthropy, I think I can say this, is that oftentimes, however, and no, this may not be true of those corporate foundations that may be here and I know are even sponsoring this event. The banks are probably unique in the sense that they really are play significant roles in their corporations and in their investment decisions. But in many other corporations, it is often not a major driver of corporate decisions or dollars. So we started with corporate foundations and quickly actually changed the function. Originally, the office was called the Philanthropic Engagement, and we changed it to Office of Strategic Partnerships to kind of signal to the field that we were talking about partnerships with the private sector more broadly and not just philanthropy. And so we really expanded our reach to be thinking about the C-suite in general and not just thinking about when you work with corporations and government to be going after the foundation, but how do you actually work with the major drivers of change within the corporation. So that could be the HR executive, looking at how you utilize the entire assets of a company's human capital, the technology companies where they could bring in innovations in technology and education and resources and platform development, et cetera.
I think Suzanne is right in terms of how to look at many corporate foundations versus the broader corporate body. There's some shift in that's been going on. I think more and more corporate foundations are being tied to the business interests, less a kind of separate community relations function and more integrated. But they often, Well, it's really interesting. When we helped start a Office of Strategic Partnership in the mayor's office in San Francisco, which I'll talk a little bit more later, the mayor's office had asked me to help raise private dollars to support 50% of it, to do it as a partnership. And the kind of longstanding family foundations in San Francisco and the community foundation came quickly to the table. The new tech corporations, the Airbnbs and Googles and their community relations people were really interested in it, wanted to do it. And when it went up the corporate ladder, the lawyers all stopped it.
No kidding. Why?
Because they didn't want to be seen as funding a position in the mayor's office. That it would appear as a conflict of interest, even though it would be helpful to them to have that position.
And that was your corporate constituency in San Francisco.
Some of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this effort is new, and a similar one in Oakland, but the core of the funders have been the more longstanding local and regional and state funders, and not the new tech.
Give us an idea of how these innovative models and partnerships can outlast transitions in government.
I think what I would say about our office in Michigan is it was created by philanthropy. And I think that is really what's given it its staying power. While we sit in the governor's suite of offices, we are a private office in state government, and we adhere to that. There are 3 operating agreements around how we function and how I'm shared with the governor's office. But it was philanthropy in the beginning who decided that this was an important thing to happen. If some of you remember back in 2000 and 2003, the dot-com bubble, foundations in Michigan, we have a wealth of them. We are really blessed with a wealth of foundations in Michigan. But they recognized they couldn't keep acting alone on the same challenges that government was working on. So they made a decision that they were going to try to reinvent a model that had been tried in Detroit during the late 80s and early 90s to see if they could make it better at the state level, and offered the model to then Governor-elect Granholm, who readily accepted it, and then I was selected to run the office. But it has been the staying power. When the transition was ready to happen, we had to go through the transition as if we were staff of the governor's office. We created the briefing, the legacy documents. We lost our email accounts, our phones, and everything. But what philanthropy had done, and Rob Collier, who heads up the Council of Michigan Foundations and acts as our fiduciary, he had through the advice of our advisory council, had said, we need to talk to the candidates. So he made a point of introducing our office to the candidates during the election period and said to them, philanthropy wants this office to stay. They're working on some important issues that you're going to care about if and when you're elected. And that really was the impetus. We have an advisory council that is made up of foundations and a representative of the governor's office, so they are constantly at our back. They have our backs, and I think that really has made a difference.
Tell us a little bit about that. How many members? How often do they meet? How engaged are they in what you do?
Sure. They are all funders of the office. Most of them are original funders of the office. So they have stayed with us throughout. High level, most of them are either presidents or vice presidents of their foundations. It represents the wide spectrum of funders in Michigan, from community foundations to large private foundations. I think there are 13 members right now, and they are active. We meet with them about 4 times a year. Our agreement requires 3 to 4 times, sometimes more often than that, and as well. But they are very engaged in the work.
Pam, tell us, let's talk about the city, because I feel like we have a really good look into how the state operation worked, the federal, but in order to bring us up to date on the San Francisco, Oakland.
Well, let me start with that. I worked for 3 mayors over 12 years in community development, being a funder. And I thought I knew transition to philanthropy. I know the nonprofit sector. I know what good grant making looks like. I come into philanthropy about 13 years ago, and I'm stunned, frankly, by how different the sectors are. It is two different species. They don't know each other very well. They don't trust each other. They don't have a great appreciation of what each brings to the table. It was shocking to me that I'd be sitting in philanthropic events talking, and people would be talking about fighting poverty and had no relationship with local government. I have a bias. Local government is where the rubber meets the road, I think, in a lot of ways. There are, at state and federal levels, there's a bit of a distance you can have. In philanthropy, there's even a bigger distance than we can have. Things can blow up in local government. If you're in there, you got to deal with it, whether you made it or not. You have no choice. The accountability is at a very high level. The transparency, maybe there needs to be more government transparency. I can tell you in San Francisco, there's a ton of it. So, I had to publish my agenda online. And you learn how to do business. You have to get around it, which is a problem. But so I've kind of made it a little bit my mission to improve the working relationships between local government and the philanthropic sector in the Bay Area. And had talked to prior mayors about establishing some sort of clearinghouse office. We didn't have the term Office of Strategic Partnerships. Very helpful that USC Center had done some great work around best practices around offices of strategic partnership. And about 2 years ago, Mayor Ed Lee and I had breakfast, and he said, "Can you please help organize philanthropy?" And I laughed, and I said, "No." But you can organize yourself to take better advantage of it. And part of the challenge in San Francisco, and I'll talk about Oakland a little bit too, because I'm working on both sides of the Bay, but part of the challenge in San Francisco is, in fact, there are a tremendous amount of foundations, family, community, private, corporate, all wanting to do something, and there was no entity in government to address it. And within city government, every department and every division of every department was like, let's go talk to Twitter, let's go talk to Google, let's go talk to Bank of America. It didn't matter. Everybody had their own relationships or trying to forge them, and it was chaotic. So we hired Colin. So what I did actually was give to the mayor and his chief of staff a copy of the best practices executive summary. Out of USC. And they said, okay, we want to do this. We'll put up half the money. You raise half the money from your colleagues in philanthropy. It was easy to do. We had a joint search committee with city staff and funders. Colin Lakon, who's the former executive director of Northern California Grantmakers. You got to at least raise your hand.
There you are.
And because part of it, this is, and I think Karen can talk about this too, this is a dance. There is an internal game and there is an external game. You have to build the relationships and the credibility. It's why it's important, like in Michigan, that it's in the mayor's office. It's a high-level staff person. We had to have that fight with the mayor's office in San Francisco about where that position got placed, and we won that fight. So there's an internal game, building the relationships with department heads and division heads, and then there's an external game of building the relationships with philanthropy. We are still in its infancy. And the other thing that I would say, I certainly knew, and hoping that a lot of my philanthropic colleagues will join me in being patient, because I don't think you get instant results from this.
Karen, you're experiencing the same thing, obviously, time-consuming, patience. So many moments of thinking I'm going to walk away from this probably as well, right? Oakland, same situation.
Oakland, really totally different situation. Oakland is not as philanthropically endowed as San Francisco is, even though a lot of us work on both sides of the Bay, and part of it has been a very dysfunctional city government for a number of years. When Mayor Libby Schaaf came into office, there was some confidence that there was an adult in City Hall, and folks wanted to work with her. And she's had great ideas, and she's hired really, really smart people. And though there had been attempts in prior administrations in Oakland to craft some sort of Office of Strategic Partnership, there was no there to do it. With Libby, there has been. It's newer than the San Francisco office, which is also relatively new. And there's a greater focus on economic development and equity on it. And part of it reflects a less developed city infrastructure than San Francisco. And so, again, but there's a lot of funders at the table. There's a advisory group that meets with the director of this office about every 3-4 months. And I'd like to say there's going to be great results. I don't think we know yet.
This is extremely challenging work. Everybody has acknowledged that on each part of the sector we're talking about. I'd love to hear from stories for the people that are here today. Let us in on something that has been your most extreme challenge and basically how you worked your way out of it. And again, from a storytelling perspective, more than just kind of, what was
Wonky frameworky stuff?
Really? Exactly.
Can I give some wonky frameworky stuff first?
Just a teeny bit.
Okay, so, because I think that...
Just kidding, of course.
I think that, the common themes are here, right? Having someone who can actually translate
That's right.
between communities, who can code switch between cultures is actually a pretty important thing. Having just someone who can do that who is not strategic is not actually helpful because they can collect resources, but they can't actually help you organize and leverage the resources. And then being clear about all the different ways in which philanthropy can add value to the work the government does, and I'll just tick them off really quickly. Things we can't do easily. Can't hire consultants to get studies done to inform our work. We can't hire people at salaries that are outside our range to get specific expertise inside. It is very hard for us to deploy technical assistance resources quickly, in particular, to folks who need them, and especially in a way that is on an as-needed basis as opposed to blanket for everyone. So, if you tick through that list of things you know you can do that we can't do, and you keep asking yourself, why can't they do that? The answer is we can't do that. And so that brings me to my story, which is something I'm not sure everyone thinks about when they think about My Brother's Keeper, is a race and gender-specific program, sponsored from a member of the federal government. Outside of these circles, there were a lot of people who talked about that. There was this little group called Justice Watch, and aptly named.
They just keep you strong.
And for those of you who don't know, they're the people who sue you every time you look like you're doing something race or gender specific. Anyway, I think I had 62 FOIA requests from them. So when we started up My Brother's Keeper, the president, for those of you who don't know the story, people, I think probably almost everyone remembers him giving a very personal statement after the George Zimmerman verdict in Trayvon Martin case. He literally came out of there and said to the advisors around him, I don't want those words to be hollow. I wanted you to make that real. And in that, he had said, we need to show our young boys and men of color that we're willing to invest in them, we believe in them, and we care for them. So how do you make that real when you are the federal government and you have the constraints of the federal government? Well, first thing that became very apparent is that the partnership with private entities on the outside that had a shared commitment was going to be very important, and bringing those folks to the table. The second part of that is many of the folks involved in that work have been involved in it for a long time, and they're like, welcome to the party. We've been at this for a really long time. The third part that is tricky is the way that you have leverage as the federal government is not only bringing attention to an issue, but the reality is the federal government does a lot of stuff. It needs to be well informed. But how do you create an infrastructure that can take full advantage of the policy apparatus, the regulatory apparatus, and the programmatic infrastructure to pursue something that has very specific goals that lots of people on the outside wonder whether that's something the federal government should be doing? So we figured that out. And the good news is that when you dig into it, things that are good for boys and men of color, right? They have to be good for lots of kids. Figuring out how to deliver on that was extraordinarily tricky. That's the government piece of it. On the philanthropic piece of it, the part that was hard was figuring out how to step into this community of people who had a tremendous amount of ownership of this issue, both at the national level and at the local level, and finding ways to try and actually partner with them to move things along. And to get specific things on the table. And I will say, I bring it up because we were not universally successful by any stretch of the imagination. The conversations in some circles are still going on. And yet there are folks who have leaned completely in to try and create opportunity and
What was the
leverage.
tipping point there? Because I'm thinking Harlem Children's Zone, I'm thinking all of these
So
organizations
what
that
I
are.
will say is, the tipping point has come from, to be totally honest, moving from national conversations to local conversations. And being clear, even though we went out way too early to ask people to join as MBK communities and try and get the work done, once those mayors signed up and we could match them with philanthropic partners who wanted to try and do the work, and they had a framework around which to work, people have been able to move pretty significantly in lots of places. Nothing like the kind of national drive that I wanted to see.
So all politics is local.
It
then.
is
It
ultimately
really
local.
is.
I
Yeah.
mean-
Karen, you're shaking your head too. I just want to make sure you're engaged in this
Yes,
part of the
I
conversation.
want to piggyback on James's comment. In Michigan, several months before My Brother's Keeper came out, our legislature wanted to implement a retention program for third graders who couldn't read without any combined effort around improving the education quality, teaching, anything like that. Just fail the 7- and 8-year-olds and leave them in the same classroom the next year. So we were going to do some work at the request of our affinity group around education, our foundation affinity group. We were going to help put together a day-long event. I saw it as an opportunity to hook boys of color to it. And in the planning process with a few of our foundations, we had a community foundation from Upper Michigan, which is primarily 99% white and rural. And she's like, I understand the Detroit funders wanting to talk about this, but I don't know why me and my colleagues would want to. So my answer to her was similar to yours, Jane, is that your rural boys are in the same boat as the black boys in Detroit, Flint, Saginaw, or Pontiac. And if we learn how to effectively deal with them, we will effectively improve your education. And when we looked at the stats, Detroit was one of the worst cities in the country for educating black boys. But when we looked at the rural stats, they were no better. And so, it was an opportunity for them to learn as well. And it turned out with them being very positive from that day. So that's one quick example. Second example is early on in the Granholm administration, she was gung-ho about the brain research around early childhood. And, the philanthropy was excited that there's this governor who's all about brain research. So a foundation comes in, out-of-state foundation comes in to do a learning around Michigan. What they learned is the advocacy community is all over the place. And they've not organized because there was no leadership and no interest until this point. So they talked to the newly appointed education advisor and said, I don't know, we were excited about your governor, but now we're beginning to wonder if we can do anything in Michigan. She comes down the hall to me, and I'm located down the hall from the policy advisors, which is really important, where I'm located. And she walks down and says, I had this conversation with them. I'm thinking I'm going to tell them I understand and maybe give us a couple of years ago. I said, hold it. I said, can I talk to her, the program officer? She said, sure. So I get on the phone with the program officer. I listen. I say, I agree with you. They are all over the map. But hey, could you help us get on one page? And I said, how about a planning grant to Michigan? So we got the planning grant. The program, the governor's advisor says, well, that's just $25,000. And I said, yes, but that's the hook. That's the hook. And I said, if they give us $25,000 and we do the planning we need to do, we hire the facilitator, they'll come back. And it got us over $1 million next, which leveraged a much larger grant from one of our other foundations, which they then made as a challenge grant to our legislature. That says, if you want this $6.5 million for early childhood, you will put a million in the budget. We now have over $60 million for early childhood in our state budget.
There are so many challenges. I mean, one is, I think, one thing we often felt was you need kind of a champion or a leader on the outside. If you have this idea of partnership and you want to start with success. So if you're going to enlist a constituency of folks, you kind of want to have an idea and know that one or two of the funders in the room are going to stand up already and say that they're going to do this. Which we've probably all done in any kind of community organizing effort. Or the challenge that we started to see that we hadn't really thought through is that once you do that sometimes, I mean, we often in the beginning were playing with large national funders, I think understandably as the federal government at the kind of scale we were talking about. Once one person steps up and says they're going to do something, then instead of that being the inspiration for all to come to the table, sometimes that's then the reason for others to say, oh, okay, they've got it. We don't need to take that. Or unfortunately, some of the kind of ego things that go on, like they've got that, so I don't want to get involved in that. So figuring out how you can find the right kinds of, finding leadership in the philanthropic sector that is actually sort of, nobody's universally respected and liked, but finding the folks who are who can play that role, if we're being honest, is really important and can be really difficult. Like you said, how do you organize philanthropy? Finding the right, as Bill Eggers was talking about, those integrators, finding the right intermediary organizations that could play that role. It's essential to have an organizing person and infrastructure on the inside. You need willing partners on the outside, but you do, we all know, need that third party, whether it's the fiscal agent, it's the convener, it's the folks who are actually going to do the implementation and ensure sustainability. Finding the right folks who have the capacity and can move quickly, and that also are once you pick one, then you've lost others, all that kind of thing, and sort of. We dealt sometimes with, and we talked about conflict of interest, but oftentimes it was really perception more than reality, and kind of overcoming either the mythology of the perceptions within our own bureaucratic infrastructure or on the outside as well, really trying to enable folks to see that this wasn't about privileging any one player, that nobody was having.
Can you give us an example of what?
Yeah, well, so for instance, I mean, this I think is actually one of the great success stories of public-private partnerships from within the Department of Ed, and as with all of them, they are, I may have done the implementation, but they are all the brain children of Jim, but is the Promise Neighborhoods Institute. Jim talked about out of those flexible stimulus dollars how we had a significant amount of resources. Just to put it in perspective, that amount of flexible resources that came from the Stimulus Act was more, the Secretary had more discretion over those dollars in that 1 year than all previous secretaries of education combined had ever had. So it was really an unbelievable game changer in terms of orders of magnitude, and why I think we had an unprecedented sense of urgency to do it right, and so much interest coming from the outside. But Promise Neighborhoods, which had really been a signature tenet of the Obama campaign during 2008 about really building off of the models, many of which had been funded by philanthropy, of these comprehensive community solutions to poverty alleviation, putting schools at the center. We only got $10 million for that, so while we were talking in that first year. So that, when you start talking to philanthropy, our numbers philanthropy can understand and play with, and we had created this enormous sense of excitement and momentum in the country. And then when we got our budget, we had $10 million for planning grants. So we realized, again, I'd say Jim realized that essentially we needed to find strong partners in the philanthropic sector that could help maintain the momentum and sustain the excitement, and not kind of make enemies out of all of these great organizing communities around the country who wanted to build on this work. So that was about finding foundations who were interested in this approach, and new folks on the ground that with capacity who'd be willing to help build the field and create some kind of infrastructure outside of government to support it. And we found 4 major national players who were willing to invest in the creation of a new a new function. To their credit, they decided not to create a new nonprofit organization, because I think we all know how frustrating that is when that happens. But went and found an existing nonprofit organization that really had capacity, both in research and implementation, the Policy Link. But I would say, as folks won't be surprised, that was not without fights as to who should be the organization that gets to do this, and who. And we couldn't play a role in that as the government, because this was being funded privately. We couldn't have any influence on who were chosen, and that was very difficult. I'm probably speaking for Jim.
I just wanted to add two quick thoughts. One was that infrastructure was not just important for maintaining momentum. The reality is there is nothing more complicated, as many of you know, than this stuff we talk about called collective impact work. Like, how do you do the needs assessment? How do you do the asset assessment? How do you build a table for everybody to come to? How do you drive a culture of using data to make decisions? How do you get people to have social accountability about their outcomes? Like, all of that stuff is really hard, and it is core to not only the Promised Neighborhoods framework, but frankly, I'm like a one-trick pony. I like to take that to almost everything. That cradle to college and career and through life, with data infrastructure to tell you whether you're making progress, with evidence-based practice to tell you the things that you ought to do with most of your money, and innovation dollars to fill in the gaps where we don't have things that work. Like, that is a basic organizing thing that we don't know how to do. And so the blessing and the curse of only getting $10 million is everybody got to spend a lot of time thinking about what they were going to do, and they got some help to try and figure it out. And we still don't know what we're doing. But lots of communities have actually made a tremendous amount of progress. And then it's now 7 years later, there's actually a lot of insight about the communities that have really started to get traction and know how to do this well. So, sometimes it's better to be lucky than good. And that forced us to do something that we might not have been done otherwise. And I think it's come out better than it would have otherwise. The thing I'll say while I'm talking is, nobody wants to fund the plumbing.
That's just what
Nobody wants to fund the plumbing.
Yeah.
These data systems and all those things that enable the kind of work I just described, like, if nobody funds the plumbing, and guess what? If you are a political leader, you really can't get any money for plumbing.
It's extraordinary that hasn't changed. It's historic, and it continues. It continues, yeah.
And it's at every level.
Yeah.
Every level. I mean, part of the complexity we were dealing with in San Francisco is one of the foundations who are funding the position did a quick scan of San Francisco City and County, which we are one thing, which makes it a little easier. There found 84 public-private initiatives in a quick scan. So it's not that we haven't had relationships, tried to work together, have an extremely generous philanthropic community. But if you look at those and say, what are we learning from them? Who knows this is happening? Hey, you guys are doing this in early childhood ed, and you're doing this on literacy, and you're doing this on, are you ever talking to each other? So this part of the plumbing is a learning infrastructure. And I think that is a key role for philanthropy to build. And I have to tell you, it is hard to get folks interested in that. It is not sexy to particularly a lot of the new philanthropists, but even the ones who've been in it, it's not sexy. You don't necessarily put your name on it. But if we don't create government, it's really interesting hearing the state and federal piece, because there are a lot of commonalities. Government can't do that. They don't have the resources, and it's not part of that culture. It's not how problems come to government. It's not how government is organized. It is something philanthropy can bring to the table and build an infrastructure, build the intermediaries, figure out the data issues and the research questions. And we always talk about wanting continuous learning and being learning communities, and we're really bad at it.
Sounds like a good tech sector initiative, corporate philanthropy, tech sector. I mean, they also have the technological expertise for it as well. Karen, you have finding the plumbing story.
So in 2008 in Michigan, the autos crashed. And all of a sudden, we had a number of people, for the first time in their lives, were looking at maybe having to go for public assistance. You know, the feds were re-upping the unemployment benefits, and it finally got to a point where this is the last time. And we had folks lined up at human service offices. They were calling sheriffs. Everything was happening. And people were just saying, I just want to know if I'm eligible. So the governor really challenged her Department of Human Services, said, you got X number of months to get a system in place where people can actually log on and figure out if they are eligible. The nonprofit sector was saying, we need to do something about this. And so they were meeting over here separately. And there were a couple of state representatives with them, but they were meeting, and they had gotten to a point where they were now starting to vet vendors around benefit access. We're hearing that the state is doing their model, they're doing their platform, and they're going to have a portal. And we're in the middle here hearing both of these. And we're like, and so we say to our CMF president, our Council of Michigan Foundation president, who's been working with these nonprofits, hey, the state is doing this platform over here. What your folks are doing, how do they know it's going to work on the state platform? Because the state has to approve these people. And they keep going. They keep going, both of them. The state's going, we don't have to deal with them. They need to come to us. And we are the ones who, actually make the application process. We approve the application. So finally, we're still in the middle. We finally say, okay, let's see if we can get these folks to talk to each other. The hostility in the room was palatable. Each basically called the other as, liars and not, playing fair. And, the state, the nonprofit said to the state, you were at the table when we were doing this, you didn't say anything. They said, well, it wasn't our job to say anything. We don't make those decisions, And so we finally tried to say, and they're ready to sign a contract for a vendor. State saying, we can do it better. So we're trying to figure out, we hear that Ohio has the particular vendor in place. So my colleague, I said, you have got to find foundations in Ohio who can help us see this system. She tracked down our community foundation folks in Ohio and Toledo, said that they'd make it happen for us, a day in Ohio. We get our state agency people to agree. I say, I'll pick you up if you'll go.
Full service.
And we get the nonprofits, not very willingly, to come and get them to agree to pay to bring a Deloitte consultant, because none of us are techie folks.
Great, of course.
And say, we want them there as an objective evaluator. We do this, end of day, we realize that the state's right. They have a better system than the vendor system. We end up continuing to have to bring this group together. My colleague says, well, we don't do that. And I said, well, if we don't do it, who will? And so we play a moderating role for over 2 years between the two. We end up with this mantra, it's not about us, it's about the children and families we want to help. And we literally had people saying that through gritted teeth at some meetings.
Exactly.
And I didn't care. I didn't
Right,
care.
right.
I facilitated the conversations. We check in early on. We realized the state didn't have enough money to finish the platform. So I literally went to my newly appointed Kellogg Foundation program officer, who I had never met, and Kyle in the back will know who I'm talking about, and had to say, you don't know me, but I'm the foundation liaison, and I need you to change your grant. We can't have all of these outreach grants and the system not completed, because you're going to flood the system, and it's going to be worse than it was. She said, so you want me to go back and tell my board that I made the wrong grant? And I said, yes. Yes. And she funded the plumbing. Because if we didn't get the plumbing funded, it didn't matter what the nonprofits were doing, all well intended, because we had to finish the system. Now, nobody trusted the state, so the nonprofits actually got the grant for the state, and they held the state accountable for finishing it.
LA and Sync has now, it's just now completed its 3rd year, and it was originally started by Wallace Annenberg and our previous executive director, Leonard Abbey, and since then has been stewarded by Cindy Kennard, our new executive director, and our LA and Sync team director, Stephanie, is sitting over there. what LA in Sync was brought together to do was to really attract more investment and talent into the region of Los Angeles, and it does that by forming collaborations between the 5 sectors, so philanthropy, nonprofit, public sector, private sector, and academia, and leveraging the existing resources in order to attract those additional resources from state and federal discretionary funds, as well as national philanthropies. And we do that by convening power, bringing those 5 sectors together that don't normally come together in one room and discuss pertinent issues. We provide technical assistance to competitive organizations when applying for federal and state monies. We have an I-3 grant that LA in Sync supported.
Thank you, Suzanne.
That
At
went
least
to
in part,
CSUN.
thank you, Suzanne.
That went to CSUN for $3 million. So yes, thank you. And we become that sort of liaison, similar to what Karen's role is for local government, state government, federal government, because Los Angeles is so big. It's 88 cities, it's 80 school districts, it's 33,000 nonprofits, I want to say. Some exorbitant number like that. And so where do they come? Who do they come talk to when they need to figure out what's happening in LA, what's innovative in LA, what needs does LA have, what priorities is it investing in? So LA in Sync plays that convening role within Los Angeles. How do you build the trust between these sectors that don't normally work together, but also just your own human capacity to not initially maybe trust the person that you've just met for a first time, or have only just met a few times, and maybe not having that trust that they're coming to you without ulterior motives or their own agenda. And so how do you build that trust, especially since everyone is so busy in their life? It's not like you can just fly to DC and get a cup of coffee with Suzanne Immerman just to build that trust there. You know what I mean? So how do you form those relationships while still, I guess, being conscious of people's time and jobs and agendas and in order to make those collaborative efforts successful?
I feel like the training that I got for my role in Mayor Villaraigosa's administration in launching the Office of Strategic Partnership, and by the way, the first smart thing I did was to hire Eileen Adams to run it and get out of the way. But I'll never forget the first meeting in Mayor Villaraigosa's office of philanthropic leaders. Now, lots of people had been doing it, sort of like your quick scan. Mary Odell, Annenberg Foundation, lots of individual foundations have been doing public-private stuff for years. But to my knowledge, it was the first time that philanthropic leaders sat, and I think there were about 30 people in a room with Mayor Villaraigosa, and just kind of talked together. I'll actually just name him. I'll never forget it because Bill Amundsen, who's a leader in philanthropy, who at the time I think he had just become president of the Amundsen Foundation, and I had many side conversations about government. He's fairly conservative. He has his own impressions of the buzzsaw of bureaucracy. And before and after that meeting with Mayor Villaraigosa and many side conversations over lunch in his office, how do and he ended up raising $1 million, giving money through Amundsen for the Summer Night Lights anti-gang program. He became an active member of it, and I don't think that was his initial inclination. How do you build trust? What I started to say is my own sort of training came from organizing, from community organizing, whether it was my work in early feminism or the gay and lesbian community during the height of AIDS. I really think it's about listening and meeting people halfway, going to their offices, going and learning. And I don't think there's a magic to it, but I do think it takes a certain kind of personality. And I want to say, since so many of the panels here have been men, with all due respect, because we have phenomenal leaders, a lot of the work has been by women. If Robin Kramer had not been chief of staff to Mayor Villaraigosa, if I had not been hired, and just kind of interviewed and listened to both men and women. I don't want to put a gender lens on it, but it's the quiet, behind-the-scenes knitting work. And that's the job.
Some of it is probably the same thing about how you build trust with your kids or in any community, and it's not any different, but and I think it's because we don't generally expect to trust our governments. People don't really, they're not used to being invited in, they're not used to actually trusting what people say, they're used to having government leaders speak in, kind of talking points and not being honest. And I think part of what enabled us to build trust in a relatively short period of time was humility, transparency, really being willing to mid-course correct, to admit that we didn't know everything, that we weren't coming out of the box with all the right ideas and acting as though we had created this whole cloth and that no one in the field had ever thought of these things before or been there. And I think some of that's just attitudinal, and very quickly people just, and the word, it's a small community in some ways, philanthropy, even though people don't all work together all the time, they all know each other, right? And so very quickly word of mouth spreads, like, oh, the Department of Ed actually genuinely does want to work with us, and they actually, you can get a return phone call, and there is someone who's responding to email there. And so I think not rocket science stuff really early on made a huge difference in trust building for us, and then that that just builds over time.
Through the work that Pam did, my new group, the Legal Service Funder Network of the Bay Area, immediately was given Colin as our government liaison and as a member of our steering committee. And so that's just an example of how all you have to do is ask, and then you get great people like Colin on your team who really do facilitate this public-private partnership that we have. My question, so I run a private family foundation, I sit on the board of 2 others, I consult with about 6 others, and one of the biggest questions we always face is the issue of seed funding. I know some foundations within their guidelines are very specific to say we will either fund one time or we will fund for a maximum of years. And what I'm really starting to realize is it's sort of like investing in a stock. Why would you pull out if it's performing well? So I'd love to hear you all talk about seed funding and how, just as we've sort of transferred the conversation from programmatic funding to GenOp, maybe we need to do something similar with, I don't even want to call it the S word, because I think by definition we're really, really failing the system.
And I think the questions you raised, Claire, are absolutely correct. If things are working, if they're meeting your mission, if organizations and entities are doing the work that you think is important and they're doing it well, why wouldn't you keep funding them?
Jim, could we hear from you on that? Because there might be a slight difference.
No, I mean,
No?
the reality is that I think this is exactly right, that a lot of foundations have had short-term funding cycles and have not recognized the opportunity to add value throughout the life of something, even when it starts to scale. And I'll give the most extreme example in the government context. Like, race to the top, like it or not, think about the federal government as just a large philanthropist for a second. If you did the math on race to the top grants, they were generally less than 2.5% of an annual budget to each of those states. I mean, think about it. Most cases, much less than that. And yet, they moved a lot because of that incremental funding. Doing things that many of them knew they needed to do long before that. Data systems to tell you whether your students are learning or not, not rocket science. So, the same is true for foundations. Some of it is about operating funding. Some of it is about that incremental funding that keeps the incentives and the attention aligned on the things that matter most. And it doesn't always have to be big bucks in order to continue to drive the right behaviors. The other thing I'll say is these convening tables, the advocacy, at least in the federal government, we can't even market the resources we have. Like literally, we can only spend no money on telling people we have the resources we have most of the time. So even if you are just in the business of, for whether you're working with government or these nonprofits, steering people to the things that already exist, you oftentimes are fulfilling a function that they just can't fulfill for themselves. That is a longer term play that complements the entire ecosystem. and I'll end on this point, which is that one of the things that we need to always have foundations involved in, because I don't see a day when government is going to step up in the very short term. People always pay attention to the entry standards of I-3, you need the evidence to get in. Well, and frankly, is most important is that it also put the money in and required an evaluation on the way out. And so the only way we're going to continue to build insight into what actually is working and what's not is if someone is doing that work. And I will say, just like plumbing, funding evaluation, nobody wants to do it. So if you're going to step out of the operating role, at least staying in the role of saying, is this thing working and in what context and what makes it implement well and what makes it doesn't? That definitely is a role for philanthropy at any stage of organization, at any stage of its life.
We've heard a lot about government as partners who want to do something. I come from a place where the government has been actively hostile to almost anything around this broad question of population health improvement. And so I'm wondering what your advice is from the people who would want to work with government under ordinary circumstances. Maybe in the past we're hand in hand with them, but right now there's no willing hand reaching out to them.
I went from a Democratic administration to a Republican administration. And the profile of things that we worked on in the first administration is quite different than the second administration. So we really had to look lower into the state government to find out where are there the folks who want to do the kind of work that we want to do and our foundations want to do. And so it was working at a different level. I worked less directly with the governor's appointees and more with the bureaucrats in the second administration. And it was just a decision I had to make because I had to figure out where we could be value added. And I wasn't willing to keep fighting a fight with some folks that philosophically were maybe a bit different, and they were also skittish because I had been in the previous administration. And so I needed some proof points, and so I went someplace else to get the proof points.
Yeah, it's a really important distinction between the politicians or the electeds and appointed by the electeds and the folks who are really running things. I think there's a lot of skittishness from a lot of foundations about working with electeds. You see them change, it's messy, it's political, but there's a lot of folks who stay throughout administrations who really are good. They're great public servants. They know what they're talking about. They do great work. And philanthropy often doesn't engage with that set of folks, don't even know them.
So I think that's a good time to wrap up. I want to say a couple things. First of all, Karen has a terrific outline of the Governor's Office of Foundation Liaison, which I think is really informative and educational for all of those. And you have a couple of handouts, so they're up here and available. I also want to make sure that I just quickly say to my extraordinary Ellie and Sync staff, Lisa Cleary-Rial, Stephanie Levin, Ella, thank you very much for all your hard work and being here today to further educate ourselves on what other people are doing in this arena. And what an extraordinary panel, really. We're lucky to have all of you here today. Karen, Pam, Suzanne, and Jim, thank you so, so very much. We appreciate it.